A farmer ordered a high-tech milking machine. Since his wife was out of town when it arrived, he figured why not test it on himself first. So he inserted his manhood, flipped the switch, and let the machine do its thing. To his surprise, it felt way better than he expected, better than his wife ever had, if he was being honest. But when the fun was over, he quickly realized he was stuck. Panicked, he grabbed the manual. No help. He pressed every button, nothing. Finally, in desperation, he called customer service. Hi, I just bought your milking machine. It works great, but how do I remove it from the cow's udder? The rep cheerfully replied, Oh, no worries. It'll release automatically. Once it collects 2 gallons. Have a nice day. A tired-looking old dog wandered into my yard. His collar and well-fed belly told me he had a home and was well cared for. He strolled over, let me give him a few pats, then followed me inside, walked down the hall, curled up in a corner, and fell asleep. An hour later, he woke up, went to the door, and I let him out. The next day he was back, same routine. Yard, pats, nap, leave. This went on for weeks. Curious, I attached a note to his collar. I'd love to know who owns this sweet dog, and if you're aware that he sneaks over every afternoon for a nap. The next day he arrived with a new note pinned to his collar. He lives in a house with 6 kids, 2 under the age of 3. He's just trying to catch up on sleep. Can I come with him tomorrow? A filthy rich Florida man threw a massive party at his mansion, inviting all his friends and neighbors, including Leroy, the only redneck in the neighborhood. Leroy was having a blast, drinking, dancing, eating shrimp, oysters, and BBQ, and shamelessly flirting with all the women. Then at the height of the party, the host stood up and announced, I've got a 10-foot man-eating gator in my pool. I'll give $1 million to anyone brave enough to jump in. Before he even finished his sentence, splash! Everyone turned to see Leroy in the pool, locked in an all-out brawl with the gator. He was jabbing it in the eyes, throwing punches, landing headbutts, choke holding it, even biting its tail. Water was flying everywhere. Both Leroy and the gator were screaming. It was total chaos. Finally, Leroy strangled the gator and let it float to the top like a cheap carnival goldfish. He climbed out of the pool, dripping wet, as the stunned crowd stared in silence. The host finally spoke. Leroy, I reckon I owe you $1 million. Leroy, still catching his breath, said, Nope. Don't want it. The rich man insisted. How about $500,000? Leroy shook his head. A new Porsche, a Rolex, stock options? Again, Leroy refused. Completely baffled, the host asked, Well then, what do you want? Leroy wiped his face, looked around, and growled, I want to know which Samama Beach pushed me in the pool. A man couldn't stand his wife's cat. One day, he decided to get rid of it. He put the cat in the car, drove 20 blocks away, and dropped it off at a park. But when he got home, the cat was already there. The next day, he drove 50 blocks, let the cat out, and sped home. Again, the cat beat him there. Frustrated, he swore, Tomorrow, I'll make sure this cat never finds its way back. So the next day, he drove for an hour, taking random turns, left, left, roundabouts, until he was sure the cat was lost. Finally, he let it out and floored it home. A few hours later, his wife answers the phone. It's her husband. Is the cat there? He asks. Yes, he's been here for a while. Why? Put that bastard on the phone. I'm lost and need directions. A big city lawyer was representing the railroad in a lawsuit filed by an old rancher. The rancher's prized bull had gone missing from the section where the railroad passed through his land. All he wanted was fair compensation. The trial was set to take place in the back room of the general store, presided over by the local justice of the peace. Before proceedings even started, the slick lawyer pulled the rancher aside, trying to settle out of court. He laid on the charm, worked his negotiation magic, and finally convinced the rancher to accept half of what he was asking. After the rancher signed the release and pocketed the check, the lawyer couldn't resist gloating. You know, old man, I hate to say it, but I pulled one over on you. I couldn't have won that case. The engineer was asleep, and the fireman was in the caboose when the train went through your ranch. I had no witnesses. I bluffed you. The old rancher tipped his hat, smiled, and replied, "Well, son, I was a little worried about winning that case myself, 'cause my bull came home this morning." 3 pets, a golden retriever, a parakeet, and a cat, all pass away and arrive in heaven. As is tradition, God personally welcomes each one to determine their place in the afterlife. Turning to the golden retriever first, God says, "The book of life shows you've been a very good boy, but tell me, in your own words, what do you believe in?" The dog wags his tail and replies, "I believe in loyalty, companionship, and unconditional love. I was a devoted member of my family for many years." God smiles warmly. "Truly you have a pure and loving heart. You shall sit at my right hand." Next, God looks to the parakeet. "And what do you believe in?" The bird flutters its wings and says, "I believe in color, joy, and music. I filled my owner's home with song and beauty." God nods. "Your voice is magnificent, and your melody shall echo through the heavens. You shall sit at my left." Finally, God turns to the cat. "And you, majestic little hunter, what do you believe in?" The cat glances lazily at God's throne, stretches, and replies, "I believe you're in my seat." Mitch was having a terrible day at the racetrack, losing bet after bet, when he noticed a priest step onto the track and bless the forehead of one of the horses lining up for the 4th race. Lo and behold, that long-shot horse won. Intrigued, Mitch kept watching. Before the 5th race, the priest blessed another horse. Mitch rushed to place a small bet, and bam, that horse won too. By the 6th race, Mitch was convinced he'd cracked the system. When the priest blessed a horse, he bet big, and sure enough, it kept working. Race after race, long shots were winning, and Mitch was raking in cash. By the final race, he was all in. He sprinted to the ATM, withdrew every cent he owned, and waited for the priest's next blessing. Sure enough, the priest stepped onto the track, but this time he blessed the forehead, eyes, ears, and hooves of an old nag, the longest shot of the day. Mitch grinned. Jackpot! He put everything on the horse and then watched in horror as the nag came in dead last. Devastated, Mitch stormed down to the track and confronted the priest. "Father, what happened? All day every horse you blessed won, but in the last race the horse you blessed lost by a Kentucky mile. Now I'm completely broke." The priest nodded sympathetically and said, "Son, that's the problem with most people. You don't know the difference between a simple blessing and last rites." A farmer drove up to a neighbor's house and knocked on the door. A 9-year-old boy answered. "Hey there, kid! Are your mom or dad home?" the farmer asked. "Nope, they went to town." "How about your brother, Howard?" "Nope, he went with them." The farmer shifted uncomfortably, mumbling to himself. The boy noticed and said, "I know where all the tools are if you need to borrow one, or I can give Dad a message." The farmer sighed. "Well, son, I really need to talk to your dad about your brother Howard getting my daughter Susie pregnant." The boy thought for a moment, then shrugged. "You'll have to ask Dad about that. I know he charges $50 for the bulls and $15 for the pigs, but I've got no idea what he charges for Howard." A 75-year-old woman had one true passion, fishing. One day, while out on the water, she heard a voice say, "Pick me up." Looking around, she saw no one. Figuring she was imagining things, she heard the voice again. "Pick me up." This time she looked down and saw a frog floating nearby. "Are you talking to me?" she asked. The frog replied, "Yes, I'm talking to you. Pick me up, kiss me, and I'll turn into the most handsome man you've ever seen. I'll be your husband, and I'll make sure all your friends are jealous." The woman stared at the frog for a moment, then reached over, picked it up carefully, and placed it in her shirt pocket. The frog, bewildered, croaked, "What are you doing? Didn't you hear me? Kiss me, and I'll be your beautiful husband." The woman opened her pocket, glanced at the frog, and said, "Nah, at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog. With age comes wisdom." A man settles into his seat next to the window on a plane, and shortly after, another man sits beside him, placing his black Labrador retriever in between them. The first man looks puzzled and asks, "Why is the dog allowed on the plane?" The second man smiles and says, "I'm a DEA agent, and this is my dog, Sniffer. He's the best sniffing dog around. I'll show you once we're airborne." The plane takes off, and once it levels out, the agent says, "Watch this," as he commands Sniffer to search. Sniffer jumps down, walks down the aisle, and sits purposefully next to a woman for several seconds before returning to his seat and placing one paw on the agent's arm. The agent says, "Good boy," then turns to the man beside him. "That woman is carrying marijuana. I'll make a note of her seat number, and the authorities will handle it when we land." The man nods. "Impressive." The agent commands Sniffer to search. And again, Sniffer walks along the aisle, sits next to a man for a few seconds, then returns to the agent, this time placing two paws on the agent's arm. "That man's got cocaine," the agent says, jotting down the seat number. "I like this," says the first man, clearly impressed. The agent gives Sniffer the command to search again. This time, Sniffer trots up and down the aisle, sits down for a moment, and then races back to the agent, leaps into the middle seat, and proceeds to poop all over the place. The first man is shocked and disgusted, unsure of what just happened. He turns to the agent and asks, "What on earth just happened? Why would a trained dog do that?" The agent, a little flustered, replies, "He just found a bomb." A butcher is shooing a dog out of his shop when he notices something strange. The dog is carrying a $10 bill and a note in his mouth that says, "5 lamb chops, please." Amazed, the butcher takes the money, packs the chops into a bag, and hands it to the dog. He quickly shuts up shop and decides to follow him. The dog walks calmly to the traffic light, waits for the green, checks both ways, and trots across the street to a bus stop. He checks the timetable and sits on the bench, waiting. When the bus arrives, the dog walks around to the front, examines the bus number, and hops aboard. The butcher follows him, astonished. As the bus drives into the suburbs, the dog looks out the window, then stands on his back paws to press the stop bell. The butcher follows him off at the next stop. The dog runs up to a house and drops the bag of chops on the doorstep. He then starts running back and forth, throwing himself against the door. Whap! The butcher watches in disbelief as the dog repeats this a few more times. Still no answer. The dog jumps on a wall, walks around the garden, beats his head against a window, then jumps off, waits by the front door again. Finally, a big guy opens the door and immediately starts cursing and shouting at the dog. The butcher runs up and shouts, "What the hell are you doing? This dog's a genius." The man sighs and shakes his head. "Genius, my ass. This is the second time this week he's forgotten his keys." A big city lawyer went duck hunting in rural North Alberta. He shot a duck, but it fell on the other side of a fence into a farmer's field. As the lawyer climbed over the fence, an elderly farmer drove up on his tractor and asked, "What do you think you're doing?" The lawyer, slightly irked, replied, "I shot a duck, and it fell in your field. I'm going to retrieve it." The old farmer, Peter, shook his head and said, "This is my land, and you're not coming over here." The lawyer, with a smirk, said, "I'm one of the best trial lawyers in Canada. If you don't let me get that duck, I'll sue you and take everything you own." The farmer smiled and said, "Apparently you don't know how we settle disputes around here. We use the 3-kick rule." The lawyer, intrigued, asked, "What's the 3-kick rule?" The farmer replied, "Well, since this is my land, I go first. I get 3 kicks, then you get 3, and so on, back and forth until someone gives up." The lawyer, thinking he could easily outlast the old man, agreed to the terms. The farmer slowly climbed down from his tractor, walked over to the lawyer, and with a slow, deliberate motion planted the toe of his heavy, steel-toed work boot straight into the lawyer's groin. The lawyer crumpled to the ground. Not missing a beat, the farmer delivered a second kick to the lawyer's midriff, sending him to the ground, gasping for breath. The farmer, now with a grin on his face, delivered a third kick right to the lawyer's rear end, sending him face first into a fresh cow pie. The lawyer, barely able to stand, slowly got to his feet, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket, and said, "All right, old man, now it's my turn." The farmer smiled and said, "You can have the duck." A young man named Joe bought a horse from a farmer for $250. The farmer promised to deliver the horse within a few days. A couple of days later, the farmer pulled up to Joe's house and said, "Sorry, son, but I have some bad news. The horse died." Joe, a bit frustrated, replied, "Well then, just give me my money back." The farmer shrugged and said, "I can't do that. I've spent it already." Joe thought for a moment and said, "All right then, just bring me the dead horse." The farmer raised an eyebrow. "What are you going to do with a dead horse?" Joe grinned and said, "I'm going to raffle him off." The farmer was skeptical. "You can't raffle a dead horse." Joe smiled confidently. "Sure I can. I just won't tell anyone he's dead." A month later, the farmer ran into Joe and asked, "So what happened with that dead horse?" Joe beamed and said, "I raffled him off. I sold 500 tickets at $5 each and made a profit of $2,495. The farmer was stunned. "Didn't anyone complain?" Joe nodded. "Just the guy who won, so I gave him his $5 back." There was once a magician on a cruise ship who performed mostly sleight-of-hand tricks. He had a regular spot in the ship's evening entertainment. While he was actually a pretty skilled magician, his performances were always disrupted by the ship's mischievous parrot, who would fly around squawking out his secrets like, "It's up his sleeve, it's up his sleeve, it's in his pocket, it's in his pocket, it's in his mouth, it's in his mouth." The magician was getting fed up and finally threatened, "If you ruin my act one more time, I'm going to kill you." That evening, right at the climax of his act, just as he was about to disappear in a puff of smoke, the ship hit an iceberg and sank within seconds. Miraculously, the magician and the parrot were the only two survivors. The magician found himself lying on a piece of driftwood, dazed and confused. As he slowly opened his eyes, he saw the parrot staring at him with its beady little eyes. For hours, the parrot just stared at him. Finally, it broke the silence. "Okay, I give up. What did you do with the ship?" A local business was looking for office help and put up a sign in the window. "Help wanted, must be able to type, must be good with a computer, and must be bilingual. We are an equal opportunity employer." A short time later, a dog trotted up to the window, saw the sign, and went inside. The dog wagged its tail at the receptionist, then walked over to the sign, looked at it, and whined. Getting the idea, the receptionist called the office manager. The manager came out, surprised to see the dog, but the dog seemed determined, so the manager led him into the office. The dog jumped up onto the chair and stared at the manager. The manager said, "I can't hire you. The sign says you must be able to type." The dog jumped down, walked over to the typewriter, and typed out a perfect letter. He took the letter and trotted back over to the manager, then jumped back on the chair. The manager was stunned but said, "Okay, you can type, but the sign also says you need to be good with a computer." The dog jumped down again and went to the computer. The dog worked through various programs, creating a spreadsheet, a database, and even a presentation which he presented to the manager. By now, the manager was completely dumbfounded. He looked at the dog and said, "I realize you're incredibly talented, but I still can't give you the job." The dog jumped down once more and trotted over to the sign, placing his paw on the part about being an equal opportunity employer. The manager replied, "Yes, but the sign also says you must be bilingual." The dog looked at the manager, then straightened up and said, "Meow." Two lifelong friends, Dan and Benny, made a pact that whoever died first would come back to tell the other what life after death was like. Their biggest fear was that there was no afterlife at all. After many years, Dan was the first to pass away. Benny mourned him and waited for a sign that Dan would keep his promise. 2 months later, as Benny was sleeping, Dan's voice suddenly filled his head. "Benny! Benny! My gosh, is that you, Dan?" "Yes, it's me. I've come back, just like we agreed." "That's amazing. So, what's it like?" "Well, every day I wake up, have intercourse, then breakfast, and head off to the golf course. After some time there, I have intercourse again, bask in the sun, and then have intercourse a few more times. Then lunch, lots of greens to stay healthy, another round of golf, and pretty much more intercourse for the rest of the afternoon. After dinner, it's back to the golf course, followed by even more intercourse until late at night. Then I catch some sleep, and the cycle starts all over again." "Wow, Dan, heaven sounds incredible. Heaven! I'm a rabbit somewhere in Arizona." One day, a mother-in-law, frustrated with her daughter-in-law, said, "Shame on your life. It's been 7 years since you got married, and you've only had one child." The daughter-in-law, not one to back down, responded, "Well, even more shame on your son's life. If I had depended only on him, we wouldn't even have this one." An out-of-work mime visits the zoo, hoping to earn some money as a street performer. But as soon as he draws a crowd, the zookeeper grabs him and drags him into his office. "Listen," the zookeeper says, "our most popular attraction, the gorilla, just died, and we can't afford to lose visitors. If you dress up in a gorilla suit and entertain the crowd until we get a new one, I'll pay you well." Desperate for cash, the mime agrees. The next morning, he puts on the suit and steps into the cage. To his surprise, it's the best gig ever. He eats, sleeps, swings on tires, and the crowds love him. But after a few weeks, the novelty fades. People start paying more attention to the lion in the next cage. Determined to keep the spotlight, the mime climbs to the top of his cage, swings over the partition, and dangles above the lion's den. The lion goes nuts, roaring and pacing. The crowd erupts in cheers. Seeing their reaction, the mime makes it a daily routine, teasing the lion, drawing bigger crowds, and earning bonus pay from the zookeeper. Then, one fateful day, he slips and falls. The lion lunges. The mime scrambles, screaming, "Help! Help! Someone help me!" The lion pounces, pins him down, and growls, "Shut up, you idiot! You want to get us both fired?" A man walks into a pet shop and tells the owner he wants to buy a pet that can do everything. The shop owner suggests a faithful dog. "A dog?" the man replies. "Come on, I need something that can do everything." The owner thinks for a moment. "How about a cat?" "No way. A cat can't do everything. I want a pet that can do everything," the man insists. After a bit of thought, the shop owner says, "I've got it. A centipede." "A centipede?" the man asks, puzzled. "I can't imagine a centipede doing much, but okay, I'll give it a try." The man takes the centipede home and says, "Clean the kitchen." 30 minutes later, he walks into the kitchen, and it's spotless. All the dishes are washed, dried, and put away. The countertops are clean, the appliances are sparkling, and even the floor has been waxed. He's amazed. "Go clean the living room," he says. 20 minutes later, he walks into the living room. The carpet is vacuumed, the furniture is dusted and cleaned, the pillows are fluffed, and even the plants have been watered. "This is unbelievable," he thinks. "This really is a pet that can do everything." Then he says to the centipede, "Run down to the corner store and get me a newspaper." The centipede walks out the door. 10 minutes pass, no centipede. 20 minutes, still no centipede. 30 minutes, still nothing. Now the man is starting to wonder, where is the centipede? Did it run away? Did it get hit by a car? What's going on? 45 minutes later, he opens the front door and finds the centipede sitting on the porch. "Hey!" the man shouts. "I sent you down to the corner store 45 minutes ago to get me a newspaper. What took you so long?" The centipede looks up and says, I'm going. I'm just putting on my shoes." In a small fishing village, a fisherman is walking up the wharf carrying 2 live lobsters, each at least 3 pounds, one in each hand. It's 3 weeks after the lobster season is closed, and who should he meet at the end of the wharf but the fisheries officer? The officer looks at the lobsters and says, "Well, me laddie, I've got you this time. 2 live lobsters 3 weeks after the season closed." The fisherman smiles and replies, "No, my son, you're wrong. These are 2 trained lobsters that I caught 2 weeks before the season ended." "Trained," says the fisheries officer. "Trained how?" "Well, each day I take them from my house down to the wharf and put them in the water for a swim. While they swim, I sit on the wharf and have a smoke or two. After about 15 minutes, I whistle, and up they come, and I take them back home." The officer scoffs. "Likely story. Let's see if it's true." So the fisherman goes to the end of the wharf, gently lowers both lobsters into the water, and sits on a piling, lighting up a smoke. After about 15 minutes, the fisheries officer says, "Well, how about whistling now?" The fisherman looks up and replies, "Whistle? For what?" The officer says, "To call in the lobsters." The fisherman looks around and says, "What lobsters?" John went to visit his 90-year-old grandfather in a very secluded area of Saskatchewan. After a great evening of catching up, the next morning, John's grandfather prepared a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and toast. However, John noticed a strange film-like substance on his plate and asked, "Are these plates clean?" His grandfather replied, "They're as clean as cold water can get 'em. Just go ahead and finish your meal, sonny." For lunch, the old man made hamburgers. Again, John noticed tiny specks on his plate, possibly from dried egg, and asked, "Are you sure these plates are clean?" Without looking up, his grandfather replied, "I told you before, sonny, those dishes are as clean as cold water can get 'em. Now don't you fret about it." Later that afternoon, as John was leaving for town, the grandfather's dog started growling and wouldn't let him pass. John called out, "Grandfather, your dog won't let me get to my car." Without diverting his attention from the football game, the old man shouted, "Cold water, go lay down now, you hear me?" A woman brought a very limp duck to a veterinary surgeon. She placed the bird on the examination table, and the vet immediately took out his stethoscope to listen to its chest. After a moment, he shook his head sadly and said, "I'm sorry, your duck Cuddles has passed away." The distressed woman wailed, "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure. Your duck is dead," replied the vet. "But how can you be so sure?" she protested. "You haven't done any tests. He might just be in a coma or something." The vet sighed, turned around, and left the room. A few minutes later, he returned with an old dog. The dog stood on its hind legs, placed its front paws on the table, and sniffed the duck from top to bottom. The dog then looked up at the vet with sad eyes and shook his head. The vet patted the dog on the head and took it out of the room. Moments later, the vet returned with a cat. The cat jumped onto the table, sniffed the duck from head to tail, sat back, shook its head, meowed softly, and walked out. The vet looked at the woman and said, "I'm sorry, but as I mentioned, this is most definitely a dead duck." He turned to his computer, typed something, and printed out a bill which he handed to the woman. $150, she exclaimed. "You're charging me $150 just to tell me my duck is dead?" The vet shrugged. "Well, if you'd just taken my word for it, the bill would have been $20. But with the lab report and the CAT scan, it's $150. Three handsome male dogs are strolling down the street when they spot a beautiful, alluring female poodle. Instantly, they all try to impress her, falling over each other in an attempt to be the first to reach her. They end up arriving at her side at the same time, completely speechless, drooling, and hoping for even the smallest glance from her. The poodle, fully aware of the effect she's having, decides to give them a chance. She smiles and says, "The first one who can use the words liver and cheese in an imaginative and intelligent sentence will get to go out with me." The strong, muscular black lab immediately speaks up, "I love liver and cheese." The poodle raises an eyebrow and responds, "Oh, how childish. That shows no imagination or intelligence whatsoever." Next, the tall, shiny golden retriever tries his luck. I hate liver and cheese." The poodle shakes her head and says, "Well, that's just as bad as the lab's sentence. Not very imaginative either." Finally, she turns to the smallest of the three, an unassuming but confident chihuahua. He smiles, gives a sly wink, then turns to the lab and the golden retriever and says, "Liver alone, cheese mine." A wealthy man decided to go on a safari in Africa, bringing along his faithful pet dog for company. One day, the dog began chasing butterflies and before long got lost. As he wandered, he spotted a tiger heading his way, clearly intending to make him its lunch. The dog thought, "Well, this is it. I'm in big trouble." Then he noticed some bones lying nearby and had an idea. He quickly settled down, started chewing on the bones, and turned his back to the approaching tiger. Just as the tiger was about to pounce, the dog exclaimed loudly, "Man, that was one delicious tiger. I wonder if there are any more around here." Hearing this, the tiger immediately stopped in its tracks, a look of terror crossing its face. It turned and slunk away into the trees. "Whew," said the tiger. "That was close. That dog nearly had me." Meanwhile, a monkey, who had been watching from a nearby tree, thought he could use the situation to his advantage. He raced off to find the tiger and struck a deal for protection, revealing the dog's trick. Furious at being made a fool of, the tiger said, "Here, monkey, hop on my back. Let's see what happens to that conniving dog." The dog, noticing the tiger coming back with the monkey on his back, knew he had to think quickly. He sat down again, turned his back, and pretended not to notice them approaching. Just when they were close enough, the dog said, "Where's that monkey? I can never trust him. I sent him off half an hour ago to bring me another tiger, and he's still not back." The tiger, now terrified of the dog's supposed power, ran off in panic.